Okay, getting into document design, and this is going to be the majority of our lecture today. Text formatting. Do not underline. Underline is something from the typewriter days where you couldn't really do italics or do bold, at least not very easily. Don't underline. Usually underline, in fact, people think it's a link and you should click on it. Instead, for emphasis, use bold or italics, but use bold or italics sparingly, because if everything is bold, if everything's emphasized, then nothing's emphasized. And also avoid all caps because it's hard to read. Don't use underlining. For point headings, unless the court makes you put the point heading in all capital letters, that is sort of a traditional way to do point headings. Don't do it because all caps is hard to read. This is not too bad because it's a nice short point heading, but instead you probably want to put it in bold instead of all caps. So now I'm going to talk about fonts. Fonts can either be serif or sans serif. Serif means it has these little flourishes, these little strokes at the end of the letters. Sans serif means that it doesn't have the strokes at the end of the letters, like this example right here. So for print text, generally use serif fonts, such as Times New Roman or Palatino. For sans serif fonts are okay for headings in a print document to make it stand apart, do something a little bit different with your headings. For online text, generally sans serif is recommended, such as Arial or Helvetica. However, a lot of commentators do not particularly like Times New Roman or Arial because they've been default system fonts for a long time. In fact, they're not default system fonts anymore. On Microsoft, it's now Calibri, but they consider these fonts to be overused, tired, old-fashioned, whatever you want to call them. So what are some recommended fonts? Well, Matthew Butterick, he is an expert at typography as well as being an attorney. He wrote this book called Typography for Lawyers, and I got a lot of my information for this slideshow from his book, and he has a website as well, practicaltypography.com, that has much of the information from the book that you can go to, and he really, really wants you to use good typography in your brief, to use Whitespace, to use easily readable fonts, etc. And he believes that this will help make your brief more persuasive if it's nicer looking and easier to read. Okay, so some fonts that Mr. Butterick likes are Century Schoolbook, which is a serif font, Garamond, also a serif font. These are all recommendations for print, by the way, briefs that you're going to print out. Gill Sans, which is a sans serif font, and Sitka, which is a serif font that I believe was invented for people with dyslexia, but yeah, I think so. Anyway, all right, and he has a whole list of some other fonts that he recommends, and really he thinks that the best fonts are some of the fonts that you would actually need to purchase, but these are some standard fonts that he thinks are pretty good for brief writing for print. However, if a court requires that you use a particular font, like Times New Roman, you have to use that font. You have to do what the court says. So be sure to check your court rules. Okay, so nowadays, a lot of your court filings are submitted electronically as PDFs. So does that mean that you should use screen-optimized fonts for your PDF? Like I mentioned before, Calibri is the Microsoft font. Georgia is also another optimized font where Microsoft optimized these fonts for use on the screen for things that are read on the screen and between all their Microsoft products. Well, what happens is these screen optimized fonts, if somebody reads them via Adobe PDF Reader, Adobe PDF does something to these where it really takes out all the benefits of the screen optimized font. So the upshot is that you might as well use your print optimized font because somebody might print it out anyway. Another thing to note is that today's screens are getting better and better with the high definition screens. So really the difference between having to use a screen optimized font and one that isn't, is mattering less and less. Okay, monospace fonts are something you should never use. They just do not look as good. There are things like Courier. You could tell it looks very much like an old-fashioned typewriter, which has everything the same spacing apart, every character being the same width. Use proportionally spaced fonts such as Century Schoolbook are one of the ones that we have mentioned. Okay, so point size. 12 point is usually the standard, and it depends. A lot of courts recommend, or require, I should say, 12 point font. Matthew Butterick suggests trying a smaller font. He believes that the smaller fonts are actually easier to read, and he says, 10 point being the lowest that you should use. Kerning is something having to do with the space between two particular letters. For some reason, without kerning, the space can come out funny between two particular letters, such as this K and E. So Microsoft Word does not have kerning turned on, so it's suggested that you turn on kerning. It appears that Pages, which is the Apple word processing system, I believe Pages does have kerning turned on as a default, but Microsoft Word does not. So what you can do is you can right-click on your document, select Font, and then, as we see here, click on Advanced, check Kerning for fonts, and then select 8 points and above. Point headings. We talked a little bit about point headings before, not to use all caps for them. Instead, you should bold or indent from the left. 3 levels maximum for point headings. So you have your Roman numeral 1, A, and then 1, and usually that's it. That's usually about as much as a reader is going to remember as far as what the different levels are. So that's what's recommended. Do not strand headings at the bottom of the page. Avoid centering your headings unless the court makes you. And you can make your text a little bit bigger, not a lot, just like by 0.5 or maybe 1 point, just to emphasize your point headings if you would like to do that. Spaces between sentences. This is something, being a somewhat older person, I have to watch, because back in the typewriter days, you'd type a sentence and you'd put 2 spaces between it. And for many years after that, even when we used computers for word processing, we did the same thing. So at some point, these word processing programs automatically would set the spaces between sentences such that you didn't have to put 2 spaces, and you do not have to do that anymore. And if you do that, people will know that you are over 40. Page layout. Ragged right. This is also called left justified, and let me just show you here. This is what ragged right looks like. You have over here on the left-hand margin, it's all lined up. Over on the right-hand margin, it's kind of just whatever will fit in the space. This is as opposed to, and sometimes this is called, confusingly enough, left justified. Another way of doing it, here is what they call justified, and we see that the left margin and the right margin are completely lined up. You can use either or. Most people tend to use ragged right, or otherwise called left justified, because it has more white space to it. The thing about justified is, for one, you have to use hyphens. Be sure you turn hyphens on, and sometimes it can produce really odd spacing. So that's why people tend to stick with ragged right when they write briefs or other things. Okay, paragraphs. For your spaces between paragraphs, either use indent or a space between paragraphs. Don't use both, because that's just excessive. So if you're going to use indent, you could use the tab, or you could, just keep hitting 5 spaces until you get to where you want to start the paragraph. Problem with that is it's not going to produce consistent or nice looking results. So how you should set your indent is you should right click on your document, select paragraph, and then, as we see here, go to indentation and select first line. And I think 0.5 is about good for if you're using a 12-point font. If you're using a smaller font, you probably want to adjust that, make it somewhat smaller so it doesn't look too goofy. And if you're going to use line spacing between paragraphs, you may need to go in and actually adjust your line spacing if you think it's looking odd. Okay, margins. The court rules in our class, if you refer to those court rules, are 1 inch. So if the court says it's 1 inch, then it's 1 inch, and that's that. However, if you have some flexibility with your margins, our friend Matthew Butterick suggests that you make your margins bigger. That is so that you don't have too long of a line length, meaning all those letters that are in the line of text, there aren't too many going across, and the person just feels like they're reading it forever, I guess, and their eyes are getting strained. So anyway, make margins be 1.5 to 2 inches for 12 points. That's Mr. Butterick's recommendation. Bigger margins if you're using a smaller point size. For block quotes, as we know from your Allwood citation manual, if your quotation is 50 words or more, you have to put it in a block quote. So use 0.5 to 1 inch on the left, possibly the same on the right. It's kind of up to you. You can even slightly reduce your point size for the block quote if you want to. Adding whitespace. Whitespace really makes a document look better unless it's a crazy amount of whitespace, which we'll see in one of our examples coming up. But whitespace does, it gives people's eyes a break, and it does tend to look nice. It can help you emphasize certain things in the text, such as headings. So here, what this slide talks about is adding a space above and below the headings. So again, right-click, click paragraph, spacing, and then you can set it however you want. Usually you want to have more space before your heading because the text after your heading has to do exactly with what your heading's talking about, so it should be closer to that heading. So just to give you an idea, for a 12-point font, double space is going to be 24 points. So that gives you an idea of the values to put in those boxes. And this is just an example here. So we have the heading that just has the same amount of space between the text. It's not as noticeable. It doesn't stand out as much. Here I put a bunch more space before and a little bit more space after my heading. Looks a lot better, stands out. And now we're going to look at some examples. So here we have an example of a brief where the typography is not the greatest. So here it doesn't look too bad. It does look like the margins are a little bit off. There's a 1 inch, at least a 1 inch margin over here on the left. On the right, it looks like possibly less than an inch. And it kind of gets worse as the brief goes on and on. Either, I don't know if the margins were set differently on different pages. You will notice as this document goes on, there's a slight slant to the document. And we see the margins here are just, the text is slanting. I don't know if it got fed into the printer crooked or what was going on there. With your case citations, that they are in fact underlined, they should be in italics instead. It would make it easier to read and more modern. Okay, so here we have starting with the finding of facts, and we see the problem here is that all the facts are written in bold and in italics. Italics is really hard to read, and why do all the facts need to be in bold and italics? Like I said before, if you're emphasizing everything, you're emphasizing nothing. Okay, so here we start in with our argument, and there is such a thing as too much white space. White space is good except when you have a crazy amount of white space like you have here. So don't use this much white space, it just does not look good. And here we see that the paragraphs are not only indented, but there is more white space between paragraphs, which either pick one or the other, either indent or do your white space. Okay, so you might be wondering what happened in this, and I don't really know the merits of the case and whether the bad typography was really why it made them lose in this instance, but it is an example of bad typography, so we will go with that. So here is another brief, merit brief of Appellate, Portage County Educators Association for Developmental Disabilities. This is a brief written by Dean Oldfield. used really good typography. So we'll see an example of that. So we have our cover page. It looks really clean, really nice. Table of contents, that is looking good too. So now see, here we have our cases are in italics this time, not underlines. Looks much better. So here we have the heading is in a different font. We have Century School Book font, which looks a little bit better and, different than Times New Roman, a little bit more modern maybe. The headings are in fact in a different font, just to set them apart, and we see that the headings are in a little bit bigger typeface. The margins are consistent. We don't have that crazy slanting like we did in the other document. Paragraphs, we see that the paragraphs are indented and there's no space between the paragraphs, which is how you should do it. If you're going to indent, don't put an extra space in the paragraph. You don't need it. We have some space above and below the heading to set off the heading, in addition to the heading being in bold and in a larger font, so that's good. We have ragged right justification. I believe the other one was ragged right justification also, though. There is a block quote right here, and this is a quote actually from the facts, but it's a nicely indented block quote. It looks real nice. If you're wondering what happened in this case, Dino Fail won this case. Is it due to the typography? I don't know. The merits of the brief, how well this was argued or written, I'm not sure. But this does look really good, and so make your briefs look like this example, not the other one.